Now available in paperback and e-readers, All About Nikki, A Fabulous First Season. The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air meets Clueless in this absolutely fabulous African-American 1990s teen sitcom. Get all 13 episodes of All About Nikki, The Fabulous First Season in paperback and e-readers today. Better get the cool slow, y'all, cause we're having us a barbecue. Comcast is looking to spin off several of its struggling cable networks into a separate company. Now, according to reports, NBC Universal, which is owned by Comcast, is looking to separate several of their struggling networks, which include the news network MSNBC, the entertainment channel E, the sci-fi channel, the Golf Channel, USA Network, CNBC, and Oxygen, and make them into their own separate company, and possibly make them into their own separate company in an effort to put these networks up for sale. Now, this is a major about face for the Comcast network, which basically was a media oligarchy formed due to the Telecom Act of 1996, which allowed a network to go out here and buy more than one radio station, more than one TV station, more than one newspaper, and one magazine. However, over the last 20 years since the Telecom Act of 1996 was passed, the entire landscape of American media has completely changed. And the landscape of American media really started to change around 2009 when American television networks decided to leave their analog antenna signals to go into digital broadcasting, and this proved to be one of the greatest tactical errors that many of these media moguls made as related to overall media, especially television, because once American television decided to go from analog to digital, many American people did not want to make the transition, even though the government offered up money for converter boxes. Many Americans just didn't want to go out here and make that transition from going from analog to digital television. No, what happened with most Americans is that instead of transitioning over to digital television, they started to transition over to the internet. And as they transitioned to go over to the internet over the last decade and a half, what has happened is that people are basically winding up cutting the cord as related to cable television. And as they cut the cord for cable television, a large population of people are no longer watching cable channels like Sci-Fi, the Golf Channel, USA, CNBC, Oxygen, or MSNBC. No, most people are getting their entertainment from streaming services, or they are going to social media sites such as YouTube to go watch people that they basically have made a personal connection with as they watch them on the air. And this has been something that many of the networks have been struggling with for the last 15 years, and things have basically come to a head for two reasons with Comcast. One reason is the SAG-AFTRA WGA strike, which basically did damage to all of American media. The SAG-AFTRA and WGA strike already did devastating damage to a already rickety infrastructure for mainstream television media, and did damage because as that strike went on, basically more and more people had less incentive to go watch television. And as they had less incentive to go watch television, what happened was the audience further started to erode to the point where many of these networks could not basically be in a place where they could possibly sustain themselves from ad revenue. Moreover, many of these networks basically wound up being in a place where they wound up losing their audience to many of the YouTubers who basically were not on strike and were continuing to make content regularly. So that did a lot of damage to the overall television network infrastructure to the point where people were not tuning in, and television overall lost 50% of its audience. And in the aftermath of that WGA SAG strike, We then had the 2024 presidential election, which basically alienated even more viewers due to the polarizing, slanted news media content that was basically telling everyone that Kamala Harris was going to win the 2024 presidential election. And this did damage to Comcast MSNBC to the point where it got basically under a million viewers, getting numbers lower than many YouTube channels, and many people not trusting networks like MSNBC or CNBC for news because they basically showed how much bias they had for Kamala Harris. And since they had so much bias for Kamala Harris, many people were basically alienated from looking to go and watch MSNBC or CNBC for news, and people weren't interested in watching any of these other channels such as E or Sci-Fi, because you can get entertainment information online by just doing a quick Google search, so you don't really need to watch the E network anymore. Moreover, you can go and watch YouTube if you want to get behind the scenes information regarding your favorite movies, so that channel in and of itself was obsolete. Not to mention with the Sci-Fi channel, which was considered an essential channel for many comic and sci-fi fans like myself. What's happened is you can now watch all of your episodes of any favorite show on Max, or you can watch them on Tubi, which is for free. So there's no real need to watch any of these channels, and many people again can get their content on the internet. And since people can get their content on the internet, what's been happening with these cable channels is they're basically becoming on the road to becoming obsolete. And sadly, they're becoming on the road to being obsolete due to the greed of many of these corporate moguls who are really reaping what they sowed, later than what they sowed, greater than what they sowed, when they planted the seeds for their own network's demise by going out and lobbying the government to go out here and pass the law of the Telecom Act of 1996. Now, the Telecom Act of 1996 was where people in the media want to deregulate the media, and as they wanted to deregulate the media, they hoped that by being able to buy more than one TV network in a local area, more than one newspaper, more than one radio station, and one newspaper or magazine would be beneficial to them, because that means that they could control all the viewpoints and all the narratives of that media. Unfortunately, what's happened is, as the media has consolidated over the last 25 years, what has happened is that as we've consolidated media, what has happened is things didn't go like the mainstream media moguls expected, where they thought they were going to get all of this control. Now, these media moguls thought they were going to get all of this control when they got to be able to buy all of these networks, and they would be able to consolidate into the Big Six, which has now become the Big Five. And as they've just started to become more and more consolidated, they thought they were going to get more control of the media to have more influence over people. Unfortunately, what happened that made everything fall apart was their plan to go out here and try to get people to transition from watching analog TV to digital TV. And when TV again went digital in 2009, this is where the audience didn't go with the media as related to television, and this is where television started its decline as a medium that people go out here and watch, because as these moguls were looking at the business in the short term as related to its audience, it didn't really look at its younger audience, because most of TV's business is made with younger audiences. And with it being made with younger audiences, while they got the audience of Gen X as a TV audience and millennials as a TV audience, they did not get the audiences of Gen Z or Generation Alpha or Generation Beta. And what's been happening is that TV networks are basically seeing their ratings decline, and seeing their ratings decline because these children basically grew up with computers and later on smartphones, and as they grew up with the internet as their media, they no longer see television as an essential piece of media that they need to be captive to, nor do they see television as anything that influences them, because they get most of their influence from people on social media platforms like YouTube, and that basically minimizes the influence of many of these streaming services, which basically don't have that influence like television used to. And that's where companies like Comcast are in a predicament, and they're in a predicament because what's happening to companies like Comcast is they basically are no longer in a place where they can generate that revenue as related to ad dollars, because nobody's really watching their channels. Nobody's really watching these channels anymore. And that's what has many of these people at these networks extremely nervous, because people are basically cutting the cord as related to cable and heading over to the internet, and they basically sub and unsub from these streaming services, or they go and watch Tubi for free. So they don't have as much influence over American audiences, and they don't have as much influence over American consumers like they used to. And that basically came to a head with in the aftermath of the SAG-AFTRA and WGA strikes, which basically made it where they had to pay more to many of the people who create these shows as related to writers and actors. And sadly, that's led to them being forced to make less content, which they were making less content due to the Telecom Act, basically making it where we had less production companies. So there are less jobs basically for everyone. And soon there might possibly be even less networks, and we might possibly be seeing the beginning of the end of the 500 channel universe that Bill Clinton and Al Gore bragged we would have. We're possibly going to see the beginning of the end of the 500 channel universe, because basically we've got a lot of networks and nobody's watching them. And nobody's watching them because they can get better content on YouTube. And because they can get better content on YouTube, they don't really care about the television, which is basically granddad's media and granddad's platform, because the average age of a TV owner is around 50 plus years old, which is about how old I am as a Gen Xer. So many of the people who watch TV are mostly older people, and younger people are watching most of their entertainment on devices. And as they're watching their entertainment on devices, what they're doing is basically making things come to this head as related to not only the SAG-AFTRA strikes, but also the 2024 presidential election. The 2024 presidential election basically was like the nail in the coffin for American television overall, because many news networks like CNBC and MSNBC, they basically showed that they are just completely ineffective at this point of influencing audiences, and they basically wound up alienating their base by all of their biased pro-Kamala Harris coverage. All of that pro-Kamala Harris coverage basically turned a lot of people off, because people wanted to see objective journalism, but we really haven't gotten that objective journalism, because many of the networks, again, are owned by about maybe 5 or 6 people, and they basically look to push their whole ideas, because since they have the money, they believe they control the media, and since they control the media on their platforms, they can control the narrative on their platforms. But what's happening is that younger audiences basically don't care about the media on these platforms, and don't really acknowledge these old media platforms, because this legacy media is basically not your father's media, but your grandfather's media, because your father basically grew up with the internet. And as they grew up with the internet, they grew up with things like Angel Fire pages in the early 2000s, or blogs in the mid 2000s, and YouTube overall. And they are basically getting most of their news from places like YouTube. They're getting most of their news from other sites like Rumble and Odyssey. They're listening to content creators like myself, and they're getting most of their influence from those media platforms and not from these mainstream TV platforms. And what's happening now is that these networks basically are struggling to survive. The same thing that's happening at Comcast is happening over at Paramount Global, where they've been trying to put BET and other channels up for sale. And instead of us seeing this consolidation, what we see are these moguls basically looking to try to get rid of many of these channels, because they are gone from being assets to being a liability, and they've become liabilities because nobody watches TV anymore. And what's happening over at these networks is, again, they're looking to put this stuff up for sale, and they're looking to put it up for sale, hoping to again get the money for these networks before they wind up having to go completely belly up. But what I find to be interesting about this whole situation with Comcast is that the same thing like possibly is going to happen like Paramount Global. Whenever a black man rolls up and says he wants to buy these networks, we're going to see these guys go out here and look to say, oh, the network isn't up for sale. That's what happened in the case of BET and a bunch of other networks like VH1 when I believe his name is Byron Allen tried to buy those networks. They decided, oh, the networks aren't up for sale, or they wanted to drive up the price, showing me that when it comes to media, even though these networks are struggling, there's still white supremacy going on. And they fear the idea of a black man having the power to buy one of these networks, similar to what happened with Bill Cosby and NBC. Many of these same folks who are basically struggling would rather watch these networks go completely bankrupt rather than go out here and let a black man spend that money to buy those networks. And that just shows the white supremacy as related to these network owners and how they don't want black people to have control over the black image, and they fear black people having control over the black image and the ability to broadcast ourselves. That's what they fear more than basically going out of business, and they would rather go out of business and let these airwaves go dead rather than let a black person have that kind of power. So it just shows me how much racism still goes on, even though these networks are basically struggling. Even though they struggle, they still want to make sure that no black person has an ability to empower black people by having a channel of our own. That's what really is the most troubling thing about this whole situation regarding Comcast as related to MSNBC and all of these other channels and the slanted media coverage. Again, they would rather look to keep these narratives under their control rather than let a black person go out here and own these channels. But again, when I look at this whole situation, as someone who has studied the entertainment industry for over 25 years, it's again many of these media executives and many of these politicians reaping what they sowed, later than what they sowed, greater than what they sowed, as related to their whole plan to again control all of the media. And in their efforts to try to control all of the media, they've basically reaped a bitter harvest that basically is leaving them with absolutely nothing, because they tried to, again, grab all the sand with their hands, and they wound up with all of it falling between their fingers, because, again, had they allowed fair competition like we had under the days of regulation, had we had that fair competition, maybe these guys could have gone on a little longer. Had they left the analog signals alone, they could have basically not had to have all this migration over to the internet. You might have been able to maintain yourself. But sadly, what's happening here is that all of these people, again, wanted to sow all their greed, and now they're reaping basically a barren wasteland of media where the audience is no longer there. And instead, what's happening is, instead of people listening to minutes of this legacy media, they're heading over to platforms of new black media. And as they're heading over to new black media, they're getting an image of black people, ironically, that we possibly would have gotten with a black business owner. The same type of media and the same control of image is happening over at new black media. And basically what's happening now is that many of these network executives are finding themselves in a changing landscape where they are on the road to obsolescence. And as they are on the road to obsolescence, new black media is rising to have stronger influence over people, and having stronger influence over people to the point where people no longer care about broadcast television. Because I remember when I was a kid, being on television was considered something important, considered something major, considered something significant in people's lives. But now that I'm older, I'm seeing that people just don't care about television. It's basically on in rooms and people pay it no attention. And that's if they have it on, because most people now, they get most of their media from smartphones, tablets, and laptops, and they get their media from these different places on the internet, and they don't really care about anything going on with TV, especially biased platforms like MSNBC, which basically is just left-wing propaganda. Nobody cares about this media anymore and doesn't care about it to the point because you've alienated the audience with all of your bias, alienated the audience to the point where the audience was nothing to do with you. And that's what's the sad state of affairs of modern TV. Modern television is something that's turning into a medium of obsolescence, and I have to wonder if television will be relevant by the time we hit 2050. Now, if you want to pick up some of my positive fiction on the SJS Direct imprint and pick up action-packed fantasy and contemporary fiction on the SJS Direct imprint, such as the ISIS series, the Esteem series, the John Haynes series, the books of the Spinsterella trilogy, my sorority novel, The Thetas, or my vampire novel, Eternal Night, you can find all of those books on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find them at other online booksellers like Draft to Digital, Google Play, Barnes & Noble, and big box retailers like Walmart and Target. And if you would like to see me make more videos taking the mainstream media to the barbecue, you can drop a donation to the Patreon, the PayPal, or the Cash App so I can continue to stay on the air and continue making content, making commentary about the entertainment industry. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and e-readers, ISIS, All About the Goddess. The Goddess Next Door bears all in the art studio to catch a campus stalker in this action-packed ISIS series mystery. Get your copy of ISIS, All About the Goddess in paperback and e-readers at online booksellers everywhere. Now available in paperback and Kindle, All About Marilyn. Learn all about the struggles of a faded former teen sitcom star in this absolutely fabulous 5-star screenplay. Get All About Marilyn in paperback and Kindle on Amazon.com today. Support Black-owned and Black-operated digital broadcast media. www.niceradionetwork.com. Nice Radio Network, broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.